I turned over a bright metal shell that rippled when
She says human longing for mystery leads to a commonality of belief in immortality.
Dad's late or I'm early. Either way, I have time to scout the pens.
Redemption and claustrophobia, what artists understand. Not valuing the world.
I am Timothy Schaffert. I grew up in Hamilton County, near the town of Aurora, which is a population of about, I think back then it was about 3,500, which is the county seat for Hamilton County. Grew up on a farm a couple miles outside of Aurora, and I was born in 1968, lived there until I was 18, and then went to the University of Nebraska, Lincoln, where I got Bachelor's of Arts with a major in English, and then went to the University of Arizona, where I got a Master's of Fine Arts in Creative Writing, and that's in Tucson. Lived in various places after that, but now I live in Omaha, and I'm working as a freelance writer, working on another novel, just writing some articles here and there. Like, the landscape of Nebraska that I remember from my childhood really plays a big part in the phantom limbs of the Rollow Sisters. The girls grow up in a rural community, much like the one I grew up in, and the places they go in the novel are places I've been, and the descriptions hopefully bring to life the part of the world that I know, and feel like the part of the world that I know best. So, well, when I was in high school, there was a lot of emphasis on creative writing, and so I had a couple of teachers there at Aurora High School. Richard Shano was one of them, Steve Durbin, who encouraged all of us to write, and we even put together a literary journal, I remember, in high school. And then when I was in college, Jerry Shapiro and Judy Slater were really significant in terms of guiding me and introducing me to writing and taking me seriously. And their impact on my writing career is, it's pretty significant. So, so I count them as probably the major mentors. And of course, my parents supported me all along, but they would have rather I was going to graduate school to be a doctor or something. They still sort of stood behind me. So I started writing when I was a kid, little stories and comic books and that sort of thing. And then, like I was saying, in high school, there was a lot of emphasis on creative writing, so I wrote stories. But I didn't really take it all that seriously until I was in college and learned more about contemporary fiction. I guess I didn't actually realize that people still wrote. I thought it was this kind of antique form because so much of what we read in high school were books from years and years ago. So it was great to be introduced to all these new writers who were writing about contemporary issues and people, and to learn about the short story form and how vibrant it still is. So. Well, the novel I'm working on now, religion is kind of a major theme. I mean, it's certainly not a religious book, but religion affects the lives of the characters, and it's also at the periphery of the lives of these characters and the decisions they make in the phantom limbs of the Rollow Sisters. So I guess religion and death, certainly, the characters, pretty much every character I've ever written has had to deal with a kind of preoccupation with death, I think. So there's, and also I think there's a dark humor to my work as well. So there's the serious contemplation of of death and religion, and also a more, not necessarily comical perspective, but a more whimsical, I guess, perspective on these themes. I guess I'm interested in the idea of examining death as something not necessarily dark and destructive, but something that's a part of our lives and something that we deal with. And I think these characters probably deal with it somewhat, or have to deal with it somewhat creatively to get past their tragedies. My best way of working is if I have the whole day, where I can sort of start off in the morning, try to get going, and usually then by the afternoon I can get some good writing done. Once I get into that frame of mind and you let the rest of the world fall away, and you know, copious amounts of caffeine help too, or you know, glass of wine in the evening. So I guess the voice that I tried to not necessarily imitate, but to take on when I was a new writer or beginning writer was the voice of the Southerners, the kind of poetic prose that William Faulkner wrote, or Eudora Welty, and the very imagistic, I guess. I'm very interested in the idea of telling a story through image and gesture and dialogue, more so than you know, having a first-person account. I like a little bit of distance, and hopefully then the language of the sentence, you know, the poetry of the sentences or the music of the language will carry the reader through. I don't think there is a particular audience that I write for. I think probably a lot of writers write for an ideal reader, and that ideal reader is most likely ourselves, I guess. So I feel like I write what I would like to read. Well, with this particular book, with the Phantom Limbs, I wanted the characters to not be overwhelmed by the sadness that they've had in their lives, and for them to, like I was saying, to deal creatively with their tragedies. And so I want the book to be uplifting, but also realistic and serious. But I want it to have some of the magical elements that you can bring to fiction as well. Just persistence, I guess, is important. You have to deal with a lot of rejection when you're starting out, and you have to get your work out there and get it read before anybody will notice it. And that can be a very slow, painstaking process. So it's just a matter of being able to adapt your work on the basis of what your readers and your critics are telling you, and yet at the same time remaining true to your voice and measuring, I guess, that kind of constructive criticism in a way that it can be most useful to you, and just submitting your work to editors and workshops.
Good evening. My name is Joanna Lloyd, and I am curator of the Heritage Room. Welcome to the Jane Pope Geske Heritage Room of Nebraska Authors and the John H. Ames Reading Series. The Heritage Room is a special collection dedicated to preserving and promoting works by or about Nebraska authors. Currently, we maintain a collection of over 12,000 volumes written by more than 3,000 published authors from Nebraska. In one way of promoting these authors, the Heritage Room sponsors the John H. Ames Reading Series. This is our 141st Ames reading. We're proud. I would like to thank the Nebraska Literary Heritage Association because it is through an endowment established through their volunteer efforts that we are able to bring you programs like this. You should feel that you can come in to visit our collection during regular public service hours for individual or group tours, or to enjoy the Heritage Room as a reading room where anyone who is interested can come in and read from our collection. Our reader tonight is Timothy Schaffert, author of The Phantom Limbs of the Rollow Sisters, a work of art fiction and Schaffert's first novel. Before I read this book, I heard some of it at another reading, where the audience was told that it would be all right to laugh out loud, and we did that. A couple of months later, I settled into reading it and wondered why we had laughed so freely. The book is comic, but it is also poignant, and a reader needs to take in both of these things, even at the same time, sometimes. Richly imagined, the play of imagination, as well as of the imaginations, plural, of the various characters, asks that we read well. The author was born in Aurora and has written of a Nebraska that will be new to some of his readers. His BA is from UNL, and his MFA is from Arizona University. Let me introduce you to Timothy Schaffert.
Thank you for coming. I'm going to read from The Phantom Limbs of the Rollow Sisters, chapter 8, actually, which is told from the point of view of Mabel Rollow, the older Rollow sister, who at this point in the novel, Lily has left town, essentially, to seek out her mother, who abandoned them as children after their father committed suicide. In the chapter immediately preceding this one, Mabel was confronted with the town's undertaker, who presented her with a little toy plastic panther that she explained that when Lily was a little girl, when they were preparing the father for the funeral and the casket was open, Lily had slipped it into the casket. The undertaker then removed it and kept it secret for years, and now she's given it to Mabel, and Mabel's decided it's like a kind of a talisman of sorts. So anyway, chapter 8. With the plastic panther warm in her fist, Mabel felt drawn towards Stitch Farm. Years before, Brandy, the Stitch girl, had inhaled too much airplane glue from a paper bag on the night of her junior prom. She now sat in a wheelchair, unable to move, barely able to speak, but with a newfound gift. All the farmers' widows had made pilgrimages to the young woman's weekly sessions, standing in line with buttons in their fists and cufflinks plucked from their husbands' funeral shirts. Mr. Stitch would take the items and press them into his daughter's unfeeling hand, and Brandy would choke out a word or two, a message whispered to her by some voice in an afterlife. Mabel had always rolled her eyes at Lily, had snapped her gum to show indifference, whenever Lily returned from Stitch Farm, dressed in mourning weeds, black blouse, black skirt, her father's wedding band on a chain around her neck. After every session, Lily had plopped, shut-mouthed and gloomy, into the sofa cushions, drinking store-bought margaritas straight from the bottle. But Mabel wasn't as skeptical as she claimed to be. Lily simply needed her to be faithless and free of ghosts, needed Mabel to be the sensible one. She placed the plastic panther atop the dash of the Jimmy and drove out toward the highway. As a drop of sweat rolled into her eye and burned there, Mabel remembered sitting on the roof of the porch years before as Lily concentrated on a tattered Ouija board. Lily touched the board and asked a question about their dead father's sadness in life, and the triangle spelled out Joshua 10:13. Mabel had pretended to be absorbed in a book, but later looked the verse up in her grandmother's Bible. So the sun stood still and the moon stopped, the passage read. That's exactly what everything felt like, Mabel thought now, wiping away sweat with the back of her hand. As Mabel approached the dirt road turnoff, she slowly passed two young men pushing a stalled pickup. An older man followed them, hunched-shouldered and wiping his neck with a hanky. Rose Leaf Ranch was painted in blue on the faded-to-pink truck. In her rear-view mirror, Mabel saw that a boy, about 14, oversteered at the wheel. She considered stopping and offering her help, but she figured they'd just laugh at her. 4 men offered help by a girl. On the country road, just before the entrance to Stitch Farm, the blossom of a plastic mum flew across Mabel's windshield, a few broken petals catching in a wiper. She then noticed all the artificial flowers and silk greenery in the ditch, bouquets stuck into the ground with wires or tied to fence posts. Banners marked "To Mother" and "For My Son" fluttered in the wind, loosened from their wreaths. The farmers' wives no longer decorated the plots at the county graveyard. Instead, they took their flowers here, preferring to believe their loved ones to be not beneath ground, but in the light and wind surrounding Stitch Farm. Mabel had visited her father's grave only once, a month or so after his death, to help her grandmother plant a peony bush. On the drive home after, Mabel declared she would never return to the cemetery, as she picked the graveyard's dirt from beneath her fingernails. She'd hated the tombstone's bland inscription of loving son, father, and husband, and its ugly gray rose cut into the granite. Now Mabel wished she'd been more devoted, with some simple tradition or ritual of her own. She could have burned a candle one night a year, or left a single rose on winter days. The panther in the front pocket of her blouse, Mabel parked and stepped from the car. As she'd left the shop, she'd taken a garish daisy-print umbrella from the wall to keep the sun from burning her scalp. All the old ladies had warned her that if she ever visited Stitch Farm, to drink plenty of water and eat plenty before people were forever fainting and swooning there in the summer months. Mabel opened the umbrella and picked the petals from the windshield wiper, looking out across the farm. The only growth anywhere around was a patch of waist-high wheat, a circling labyrinth cut into the field. "Take a peaceful walk and find your center, $5, the sign proclaimed. She watched, amused, as people stumbled, dizzied from the twists of the field. Mabel recognized an old woman sitting on a rusted tractor plow overgrown with weeds and black-eyed Susans, Mrs. Lindley, who raised emu. Mrs. Lindley clutched a black tube of sunblock in her fist, SPF 50. "I'm glad you finally came out to see Brandy Stitch," Mrs. Lindley said. "What'd you bring to show her?" "Nothing," Mabel said. She wanted to keep the panther mostly unseen, to keep it her own secret for as long as she could. Too many questions about it, too much explanation, might take away its power. Mrs. Lindley held forth a dime. "I found this in the pocket of one of Mr. Lindley's trousers that I'd boxed up years ago," she said. "Brandy's finally going to be able to reveal it all to me this time, I'm certain. I just have a feeling about it. It's evidence of some kind, this coin, of an affair that he had a few years before he died. I just know it. This is change back from something he bought for her. A Hallmark card, maybe violets." Just a dime, Mabel thought, touching at her pocket of the panther inside. How sad. A cobblestone walk led Mabel and Mrs. Lindley toward the tin-roof lean-to in the pasture, under which Brandy did all her communing with the dead. A crowd gathered at the fence, many standing up on the slats like at a rodeo. Everyone craned their necks to try to see into the lean-to just yards from the padlocked gate. Shadows stretched and moved across the ground as workers, hidden by the tin wall, prepared for the morning seance. Mabel could hear country music buzzing from broken speakers. The sun was already beating down, and Mabel held her umbrella above Mrs. Lindley's head. Despite the sunblock, Mrs. Lindley's bleach-white skin cooked swiftly to pink. As Mr. Stitch stepped from around the lean-to, as the people caught their breath with anticipation, Mabel wanted to rush away from the whole event, to once again be a person too serious for Stitch Farm. The man looked silly, with a long peacock feather stuck in the band of his straw cowboy hat. Mabel giggled, both nervous and embarrassed, at the feather bristling and fluttering in the wind, strutting like it was still attached to its bird. But when Mr. Stitch beckoned the crowd, saying, "Come to Brandy," in a deep and kind voice as he unhitched the fence gate, Mabel stepped forward. His chin was stubbly and gray. No one had ironed his shirt. He'd lost his little girl, basically, and what could be worse? She dropped a donation into an overflowing kettle as she followed the crowd around the corner of the lean-to. Some cotton candy-scented candles flickered in jelly jars lined up atop a railroad tie on the ground. Mabel walked along the tin wall. Stretched across the front of it was a coiling barbed wire. To the barbs, people had stuck photos, newspaper clippings, wedding invitations, hospital bracelets. People had signed their names to poems and prayers they hadn't written about serenity and footsteps in the sand. A woman smiled at Mabel as she tied a frayed hair ribbon to the wire, and Mabel blushed, feeling welcomed into the terrible miseries they were all there to share. Mr. Stitch pushed Brandy's wheelchair out to the lip of a pickup's open tailgate. Brandy, now a woman of about 25, had to have been sweltering in her raggedy cashmere suit. The suit's skirt showed many snags from the edges of the chair. "That's the suit Sally Jesse gave her for the show they did," Mrs. Lindley whispered to Mabel. Mabel remembered having heard about Brandy's appearance on Sally Jesse. It had to have been 5 years or more before. Mr. Stitch stood beside Brandy and began without ceremony. He held out his arms, his palms up and open, wiggling his fingers. "Anybody got something?" he asked the crowd. 2 women stepped forward, one holding out what looked to be a piece of string. Mr. Stitch took it from her, balled it up, and put it into Brandy's hand. He then leaned over, putting his ear to Brandy's lips, hiding her blank face from everyone. He straightened up and returned to the string. "She says, a hat." "A hat?" the woman mumbled. "A hat," the other woman said. The crowd waited silently for the woman to make some connection. Mabel pictured a straw hat and a colorful scarf. "A hat," she whispered, desperate for the women to find their way back to a particular sunny afternoon. "Oh, yes," the woman with the string finally said. Oh, yes." She put her hands to her face and cried. "The hat," she sobbed. "Of course, the hat." Her friend took her by the shoulders and directed her back toward the gate. People stepped forward, one by one, with their bits of cloth and pieces of jewelry and letters bound with ribbon. "A flower," Mr. Stitch imparted. "A book, a picture, a necktie, a map." Some merely shrugged and walked away, but most collapsed in heartbreak and tears. The panther felt heavy in Mabel's front pocket, and she could feel its edges pressing into her breast, could feel its tiny claws scratching for purchase. Her heart beat fast with both her belief and her disbelief. She so wanted to fall apart, but she knew that whatever Mr. Stitch told her, whatever words Brandy passed on from beyond a supposed grave, would be meaningless. But she also knew she'd return to Stitch Farm with everything she could find that her father had touched. If Mr. Stitch said the right word in the right way, it might work, she thought. I could be haunted too. With all the shade from the umbrella working to keep pale Mrs. Lindley from sizzling away to nothing, Mabel felt the sun's heat weaken her knees and ankles. She noticed a few people fall slowly to the ground, some with something like a hallelujah wail, almost gleeful in their pain. Mabel lowered herself to the dirt, then became frightened by all the crazies towering above her, mere footsteps from trampling her, but she was too dizzy to move. "Do you need my sunblock, Mabel?" Mrs. Lindley said, as Mabel pressed both hands to the ground to feel still. She closed her eyes, and all the most banal junk of her life swam among the dots of her vision, just spoons and forks, pairs of scissors, shoelaces, pencils, light bulbs. She then saw her mother, her mind lost, on one hectic afternoon with her coat over a flesh-colored slip, frayed lace at her knees. That day, months before her father's suicide, Mabel's mother went from store to store, secretly slipping her things from her deep coat pockets onto the shelves in a kind of reverse kleptomania. She left a Hummel among boxes of cough elixir in a drugstore, her wedding ring and a china cup in a department store. In a dress shop, she took a Swiss Army knife from her coat pocket and dropped it into the pocket of a coat on a mannequin. Mabel and Lily ran along behind her, huffing and puffing and tumbling over each other's legs as they struggled to keep up with their mother's quick pace. Lily, frightened, had put her hand in Mabel's pocket. "Anyone else?" Mr. Stitch said, wiggling his fingers. "Anyone else?" Mabel caught his eye as she took the panther into her fist. A coffin, she thought, as if prompting him. A little girl in her best dress. "I've got something," a man shouted, and the crowd, tilting their heads with sad smiles of recognition, parted for him and the others following him. Mabel saw that they were the men who'd been pushing the broken-down truck on the highway. "Yes," Mr. Stitch said. "Come forward, Mr. Roseleaf." The one young man wore black boots held together with silver duct tape. Another wore blue jeans torn at the knees and at the back pockets. The men looked to Mabel like they had just crawled out into the sun after a long afternoon of sleep. This was exactly what she'd hoped to see, she realized, all these little signs of helplessness. "It's Roseleaf and his boys," Mrs. Lindley told Mabel as she helped her up from the ground and offered some of the umbrella shade. "The boys lost their sister in that swimming pool incident. They're out here every week with something." Mabel now remembered the Roseleaf family, who lived in the next county over, from a newspaper article she clipped for Lily years before. The sister, a girl of about 14, swam with one of her brothers. As she dove underwater at the deepest end of the pool, her hand or her foot caught with the suction of the drain, and her brother, unable to loosen her, swam to the surface to shout for help. Her other brothers came out then, and her father and her mother, and all they could offer her was their breath. They took turns swimming to the bottom to hold their lips to the girl's, filling her cheeks. One after the other they dove, carrying air to her, keeping her alive for a while with a graceful, wordlessly devised system. But she died before help arrived. Mabel had been close to the girl's age at the time. After first hearing of it, she had tried to experience what it had been like for the girl as she had drowned. She swam to the bottom of the municipal pool and imagined that the girl taught herself to find comfort in the water, in the blur of her hand before her own face, in the veins of sunlight at the floor. It would be something like being inside your own body, pulsing through your own flood of bloodstream. The shouts of her family would have been as soft as the popping of a far-distant gun. Mr. Roseleaf held out a half-eaten candy necklace to Mr. Stitch, who put it into Brandy's fist. The Roseleaf brothers all held hands, standing as close as sisters, as Mr. Stitch listened to Brandy. He straightened up, nervously tugging at his ear and at his chin. He took off his hat and put it back on. He was clearly struggling with his imagination, wanting to offer the Roseleaf family something profound-sounding, something poetic and new. Oh, Christ, just say anything, Mabel thought. "He said, a starfish, a wet starfish, in the sand." Mabel liked that, the starfish, and it brought to her mind the soft crashing of the ocean she'd never visited. Mr. Roseleaf wailed and sobbed, but the older brother, with the swift, certain manner of a reasonable man, simply stepped up to the truck to retrieve the candy necklace. Mabel couldn't take her eyes off them, and their ragged, dirty clothes and hair that needed cutting. "I can believe in your ghost," she wanted to whisper to the sweet, lost men, "and you can believe in mine." "You know," Mrs. Lindley said as the crowd dispersed, "my cousin's daughter's stepdaughter got the Roseleaf girl's marrow. Or they think so anyway. That information is kept confidential. They sent a letter to the Roseleafs through a caseworker, but they never got a response." "They haven't recovered," Mabel said, before following the Roseleafs back to their truck. She watched in a daze as the boy got behind the wheel again, and as the two older brothers gave the truck a push to get the engine sputtering. "They've lost everything," she thought. As she memorized the phone number painted on the truck's door, tapping the number out on the back of her teeth with the tip of her tongue, she became determined to know them and to know all their methods of grief. That's it. Thank you.